Thanks for tuning in to the Product Operations Festival. We really hope that you're enjoying the festival so far, because we've got even more insights heading your way in just a minute. All sessions are designed to be interactive and give you the chance to engage with our speakers and panelists, so please do share any questions and comments in the chat. For all things Product Ops, don't forget to check out the Product-Led Alliance's membership plans. Head over to productledalliance.com for more info. Lastly, we just wanted to give a massive thank you to all of our partners, speakers, and of course to you for helping us to bring this awesome event to life. Enjoy the next session. Fantastic. Well, welcome back everybody to the Product Operations Festival. I'm very excited to introduce you all to our next speaker. So we have Chris Butler joining us. He is a lead product manager at Google, and I will allow him to introduce himself a little bit more, and then he can go on with his session.
Great, thank you so much. It's great to be here and great to be with so many great product ops people. This talk is really just meant to be a quick taste of what the Product Operations Certified course is like, which is something that I teach with the Product-Led Alliance. And so I mean, I have a background mostly in product management, but over the last couple of years, I've been thinking a lot about product operations and really just what does it mean to be a product ops person? What are the types of things that we need to be doing to help our teams? And really in the end, kind of how do we do the best job we can as product ops people? So this is going to be a quick taste of what it's like to do product operations certified. And then I want to save a majority of this time actually for questions around product operations, around the course, around really anything that people have top of mind right now after all of the great talks so far. So let's get started. So what is product ops, right? I think there's a lot of different kind of definitions that are out there in the world. I have maybe a particular one, but I think it is one that is very kind of, at least one that helps, I think, set why we do our jobs and really how we can be most effective. So first, it is about helping the PM team to be as effective, not as efficient as they can be. Product management in general is a very high leverage type of role. And so product operations is meant to be leverage on top of that leverage. And when we think about like effectiveness, it's really making the right product rather than making the product right. So I think that's an important thing for us to carry into the product operations field. Secondarily, we're really the steward of the PM community, right? Not only are we here as people working to be able to make them effective, but we want to make sure that they can also work together, right? We're not going to be in every meeting. We're not going to be working on every single document with every single PM, and we should not. And so the question becomes, how do we start to build that community within the world of the product manager so that they can get help from each other as well as us? And then, I think this high leverageness is really important, right? Without product managers, I think we would not build as many great products. And there are many people that I've talked to that when they see a team that has both, either what we would refer to as maybe not as effective product managers or no product managers at all, there's a huge difference in those teams when there are product managers there. And I would argue that as we start to have more and more proliferation of product operations, that we'll see even more leverage in those teams because of the fact that we're helping them be more effective. And in the end, I really say this is PMing the PM experience, right? Everything that you do as a product manager, you will end up doing as a product operations person. And I think that kind of customer-focused approach where our customers are product people, I think is very valuable. And so where a lot of this comes from is a community-driven approach, which comes from this book. Emily Weber wrote a book about kind of communities of practice. And so I use a lot of the work from her around communities of practice, as well as a few other things. And so I always like to kind of start with saying that there's a lot of stuff out there that we can learn from that will make us more effective product operations people. And so this idea of a community practice is really about a couple different things. And so community practice is made up of, first of all, a domain. And so in our case, it's this product management practice, right? The people that are doing the work of product management within teams, usually technology focused, but could really be anything. Secondarily, there's some type of community, right? There's a group of people that will get together on a regular basis, and will work with each other, will know each other, and ideally will learn from each other. And so in our case, this could be all of the product managers in our org. When we start to think about how big of a team of product managers a particular product ops person can support, Emily Weber has referenced some interesting papers about the idea of Dunbar's number and the way that social groups start to break apart in some way. And so I think that's a very interesting one as well, is that should product ops people be embedded with product teams in a particular cross-functional organization, or should they be servicing an entire product management organization? I don't think we have a really clear answer about which one of those is better today, but I think it is important to realize that the community we're talking about here is really like any product manager inside of our org. And it could be a very large group, but it could also be a very small group in some cases. And then finally, the practice. Now, the practice itself is not only product management, right? Product management as a skill set, there are common kind of competencies or skills that people will bring to product management. But honestly, there are particularities or nuance when we talk about different types of industries, stages, products, et cetera. I've been recently giving a talk about the difference between or what is the idea of something like a specialization of an AI PM or a data PM or a platform PM. I don't necessarily agree that these are wholly new competency sets, but I do agree that they apply some type of special need or nuance to those communities of practice that may be different than another industry or another type of specialization. So this is what makes up a community of practice, right? And part of what's really important about being a steward of community of practice is really starting to think about this idea that there are a lot of things that we end up writing down, which Emily Weber and actually even Gary Klein from the naturalistic decision-making community would talk about as explicit knowledge. These are the things that we can, if someone asks us, what do we do, or what's going on with this product, those are things that we could write down very easily, right? Those are the things that are going to be, a lot of the times in the PRDs, they're going to be in help documentation, things like that. But there's this humongous body of knowledge that is referred to as implicit or tacit knowledge. That is something that is very hard for us to actually transmit to other people and to get them to understand. And so the point of this kind of graphic is really just to say that there's an awful lot within the product management community of practice that is this type of tacit knowledge that is very hard to write down, but is very important to be able to transfer between people and really ends up being an important way that product people kind of work with each other and learn from each other. And so as a steward of a community of practice, you need to think about not only this explicit knowledge, which ends up being what are all the different documents we have, but also how do we learn from each other in a way that builds more of this tacit knowledge. So when we start to think about like product operations in general, there's a bunch of different problems that I think are inside of product communities, inside of product management organizations that we need to solve today. The first one is really this idea of disorganized work. So if you find that every PM is a different process with their cross-functional team in a way that is maybe not helpful, and that there is almost zero alignment taking place. So if, I work within a team that has tens of products inside of that team. And what we found, or at least when I first got started, was that a lot of these teams operated very separately. And that was good when we were talking about them as separate products, but when we need to build an ecosystem of products or a set of products that interoperate in some way, this is maybe where product operations can start to help build those types of things in some way. The next one, which is very much related, is this idea of siloed teams. So not just the idea that product managers are not working with each other enough, but that teams themselves are not working with each other enough. And so there's no common way, for example, to really share important information between different teams. There's no way to build dependencies. And even if you do build dependencies, those dependencies are not necessarily respected or understood or even followed up on. There could be different types of frictions or problems inside of silos that, it could be that this team has a very specific problem, but honestly, most of the time, inside of larger product teams, there will be very similar problems. And that if we can't see across all of these different teams, we can't start to build systems in some way that would help us. Another aspect of product operations is really about how do we help people get adapted to the organization and potentially grow as product people in general. And so I talk about this as like sink or swim. And so there are a lot of times where I've been inside of product management organizations where it was really like you're on your own and you have to create all of your own ability to learn from each other, to get feedback, to do all these things. And I think those are pretty hostile environments. Like they're not environments that are great for building great product managers. And so we want to be able to provide a way for people to grow and improve. really on their own time, but also not just as a team. So even though you may be scheduling regular workshops or learning opportunities, we need to have a myriad of different ways that people can learn from each other and from experts inside of either the organization and also outside of the organization. Next thing is kind of related is this lack of learning in general. So as I said, being able to get feedback on what you do is really, really important for a product manager's role. But if we all are learning individually, it means that we can't share common practices that may have helped in some way. And that, if we don't work together enough, like for example, I've noticed in a lot of teams, the only time that product managers really get together tends to be in kind of group product management meetings. But those meetings end up being taken up with kind of hand downs from the leader rather than the idea of how do we build better trust between each other so that we can work better together. And then we also don't learn from the expertise of others. So all that tacit knowledge that I was talking about previously, there's really no way for us to understand, not only just from our leader, how does this leader actually think about solving this problem, or what are the mental models they bring to bear? What are the decision-making kind of ways of doing things that they bring to bear? But we can't learn from each other either. And so this lack of learning is very innate because we don't build enough of these processes into our systems. And so I did a talk with Mind the Product, which was really just about like making training look more like work. And so it's trying to address this type of thing, right? Next thing is partner problems. So it's not just about the idea of like inside of the team itself of the product management organization, but it could be with the way that that product management organization works with other teams. And so key partners, especially engineering, right? Because usually we're paired with engineering teams that do the execution of the work that we end up helping plan or figure out. They don't get actually what they need. We'll build a PRD, but it's not the type of PRD that they actually need, right? It's not something that will actually help them make better decisions or understand what they should be building. And then when those problems or frictions are not known, right, we end up getting a very divergent view of the way that the organization works together. Inside of my organization, it's a very engineering driven one. And so the fact is that when we are trying to figure out how to do things together, one of the problems you may see is that there's actually 3 or 4 different roadmaps that are all in parallel that mean different things. And so I think that's like a very interesting kind of like smell if you ever see something like that, that's what's maybe going on. Product management or product operations is also there to try to reduce process, right? I've written a couple posts within the Product-Led Alliance site just about this idea of creative destruction is what we should be doing as product operations people. When we go into organizations, usually we're not the first to be hired to help kind of figure out the process that's there. And so there will be lots of processes that already exist when we get there. And the truth is they may not be great processes. They may cause a lot of problems for people to be working together. And so these types of bottlenecks really slow people down, right? They create frictions in the ability for product people to do their jobs. And one of the things that might be a smell when this is happening is that people are actually spending way more time documenting the work rather than actually doing the work. And so, I think when we start to see that there's many sign-offs that need to happen, this also says that we may have a problem with the way the organization is actually organized in some way. And so product operations is there to help figure these things out, especially if we see this as a problem. And then sometimes product operations will come in to help fill gaps in the larger org. And so this may be where, in some cases, I might diverge a little bit from the product operations community at large, or at least the people that I tend to think of with a high amount of respect that I tend to disagree with. But things like data science, right? The idea that product operations people are there to make sure that people are getting the data they need. Same thing with user research. The idea of like operations. So the idea of like headcount and other things like that. I think sometimes product operations can really help fill this gap. But I think, honestly, it should be temporarily rather than as their main job. And we'll talk about this in a second. But a lot of the times, product operations will end up filling these gaps if you do not have these types of roles already as part of your organization. And then finally, I think sometimes product ops people will be brought in to help with, say, the strategy of something, or with the way that leadership is actually happening. And finally, I think this ends up being a real issue from the standpoint of being able to understand what product operations do, and I think muddies the water in some ways. So that's why, like, I think this is both like a pro and a con about product ops and the way that they solve things. Is that it's not always we do come in to help fill in gaps, but sometimes we shouldn't be doing that. So what does PMing the PM experience actually mean, right? What is the job that we do? And I always like to go back to, like, who's our customer? Who's the person that we care about a lot, right? And so first of all, our customer is really product people, right? That is the main customer that product operations is helping with. After that, it will be the partner teams. How are people actually working with the partner teams? How are product people working with the partner teams? How are partners working with product people? Those are our secondary customer. Third could be management. And this, I also include product leadership, right? Like, we're not here necessarily for management. We're here to help management with a lot of things. But again, they are like third in my list of customers. And then finally, like, I put it fourth here, but it's probably like a way, way, way low type of thing, is that the end customers and users. We do care about how much value we provide to end customers and users, like anybody in the organization would. But honestly, it is not our customer. We are not here to do work for the end customer and users. That's not what our job is. And so what is our product, right? I think of our product really in two ways. So one, our product is really an individual product person's experience, right? And I say their experience because we think about that journey. It's like, how do they go from onboarding to working to kind of like leaving the organization? That entire experience right there is really where product operations can make a huge difference. And then finally, this idea of the collective experience in the community of practice, right? Are people getting value out of the way that they could work with each other? And so those are the products that we actually build as product operations people. The next thing that everybody always asks, and I think there's a lot of great work going on in the community about this, is like, what are the metrics? And I think this is a really hard question because a lot of things we do are really about experience. So I think some of those things will be difficult to measure directly, but we have to consider maybe what are proxy metrics that will say that, like, someone is actually having a great experience or that the community of practice is actually helpful. And so one of those things is engagement with the community. I don't necessarily think that we should be going after more engagement with the community. And so this is like kind of a double-edged sword when it comes to metrics, but we do want to see people getting some value out of the community. We want to see people interacting inside of the community because we do believe that not only like engaging with the community is helpful, but that engagement privately outside of the community is fine. But that if people are not doing it inside of the community where the rest of the community can see, not enough people will be able to learn from those experiences. The second thing is this feeling of inclusiveness or meaning, right? If we build a great community of practice, if the experience that everybody has is really great, they will feel like they're part of a community. They'll feel like they should actually be here working inside that organization. The next one is really attrition and retention, right? Which is something I've been thinking about more and more, but this is maybe the main metric, but the slowest metric for us to be able to track is really this idea of, are people sticking around longer than they would have otherwise? Are they sticking around inside of this particular organization because of that product ops person? Now, it's not just the product ops person, it's also the leadership. It's also a bunch of things about kind of career and perf and promo and things like that. And so I wouldn't put it all on the product ops person, but I do think the product ops person has a big impact on attrition and retention. And then, really, I guess the goal metric for us is really, we've increased the value of product people being at this organization in some way. And that's very hard to track, but I think that it's one of those things that, like I said, I think that you can see when there's really, really effective product people on a team versus no product people or non-effective product people. I think there is a difference. I would also like to add that I think there's bad metrics that are out there. One of the bad metrics I've seen a lot is that we're here in some way to increase velocity. Now, not only do I think velocity is a bad metric to share outside of your internal team, I think it's just in general a bad metric for product operations to be involved with. Your job is not to be people more efficient at shipping things. Your job is to make sure they're shipping the right things. And that is something that is not possible to measure with velocity. The next thing is cycle time. Even this idea of trying to go from idea to production, I think we want it to be faster, but if it's not the right thing, again, it's not as helpful. And then just really in general, any other efficiency metric, I don't think is the right thing for product ops people to really think about or to go after. So what are some of the problems that product ops people have while they're inside of organizations? And this is really meant to be more as a warning or a place where people should start to see patterns that might start to come up for them while they're in a product operations role. So first of all, there are probably things you may do that are not really product operations types of roles. So one of those, I don't think that product ops people should be building user research repositories. You should hire either research ops or people inside the research organization should figure this out with product management people. I think this idea of data analysis and dashboards, you should work with data science people that are going to be able to be experts at this type of thing. The idea of building dashboards, I think is one, I think dashboards tend to serve more of an emotional need rather than one of actual learning. But I think the question should always be, like, who is actually getting value for these types of things? And the goal is not to build kind of an all-doing type of dashboard that anybody can go in and tweak, but it's really, what are the things that you need to convey? And how do you work with the right people to get that information in some way? But I don't think that is a product operations role, is to do data analysis. It is not to do project management or PMO. I think what's really important is that there's a tension between PMO and project management and product management, which really is the spectrum between kind of product management really being about innovation and PMO really being about risk reduction. And that's an important tension to keep there. Product ops is not meant to do more than actually help with regards to that tension in some ways. Like, how do we make that tension better? How do we make it so that it's functional and helpful? But it's not to actually take the other side of that tension. And then finally, if you mistaken the end customer as your customer as a product ops person, you may end up doing the bullshit work that PMs don't want to do. And that is something that if you're doing individual work, you're probably doing the wrong work. But if you're doing work that is more systemic, then you're probably doing the right work when it comes to product ops. There are a bunch of self-made problems though too. Like, these are things that I think people fall into as a trap by trying to do a great job as a product operations person. So one of those is really an overfocus on process. To me, I think that when we think about the idea of like the trifecta of people, process, and tools, it should be in that order. It should always be about the people inside of the organization first, and then process when it makes sense. And I think this is where there's like a really interesting question of, you know, if we're dealing with these like kind of complex systems that are people and organizations, when should we bring things from the complex to the complicated domain and turn it into a process? And the reverse is true. When do we see a process that's no longer working and we should move it back into the complex space to really understand what's going on? So I think that over-focus on process means that you're going to miss this kind of like vibe or sensing of patterns within the organization that you would have otherwise. Doing the job of other groups, I think it's something that's very easy to fall into. There's a gap. Product operations identifies it. They try to fix it, and so they end up doing that job. And then I think also setting the strategy for the whole org is really not something that product ops should do. Right? It should actually be the product leaders that are doing that in some way. And then finally, efficiency as a focus. And finally, I think one of the anti-patterns I've also seen is that if you are too worried about doing what management wants to do within a product management community, you end up just kind of like creating lots of process on top of the product people to kind of make them do what the product managers want them to do. And I think that is a really bad state to be in, because your job is not to make the managers happy. Your job is to help the product managers. Now, that can be difficult, right? That can be something that is really hard to say no to. But I think if we back into all the time saying, why are we doing this? Just like a product manager would. You don't just go off and execute. You ask why. You end up trying to understand, what are we doing here and why does it matter? Doing that type of thing helps you avoid this type of problem. And so, you know, maybe really quickly, just at the end here, I'd love to talk a little bit about what you learn inside of this product operations certified course. First of all, you'll learn how all of these different key product management skills and competencies start to apply to product operations. And that includes things like user research, actual data, experimentation, and a bunch of other things you end up doing as product managers. How do you now turn that lens onto how we make product managers as effective as possible? We talk about how you create value and then track it. I also talk about that in the first kind of 30, 60, 90 days, what you should be trying to look for as a pattern of success within the product management organization as a product ops person. And then just in general, what is some of the common work that you will end up doing? What are some of the artifacts you'll end up doing? And I guess like maybe inside of this, I tell a bunch of different kind of case studies that I've found, but I wanted to tell at the very end here one case study in particular when I was at Cognizant, where I joined as a AVP of Product Operations for a group of about 100 or so business analysts, product analysts, and product managers. And so this council meeting was something that I had gotten to that was there already. It was something that was done every 30 days for every project. Cognizant is like a consultancy. So it was really about like, how do we give an update to management? And there were a couple things that were inside of this meeting that were really important, but no one liked this meeting. In fact, I may have heard that one person had left because of this particular meeting. They just thought it was so onerous. They hated it. And so what we did is we looked at the original goals, which was 1, to update our leadership. 2, it was to get ahead of escalations. And 3, it was to understand if we could sell more into that organization. And so we started to pull these different goals apart into the process. And actually the 4th thing was to give help to the product managers that were inside this project by these senior leaders as part of that update. So we took the kind of status or need for escalation or expand, land and expand type of things into more ad hoc processes that would happen when it was detected or was something that would be async. And we really hyper-focused on this one particular case of how do we help individual product managers from the standpoint of leadership troubleshoot problems inside of a particular client or customer. And so we started to experiment with a couple different formats. We tried it with a couple different groups at first, both groups that we thought it would work well with and groups we thought it would not work well with. And after that, we end up relaunching with a council meeting that was way more effective. And a lot of people ended up saying specifically, this is a meeting that I actually look forward to. This is where I get the most help from the team itself. And so this is what I would say is like, to me, a success story for product operations is that we turned something that was a really bad, like a process that people really hated, into a process that was not only enjoyed, but was also incredibly helpful. And so those are the types of things that we'll really talk about inside of the product operations certified course. And so in ending, right, your customer is really the PM. You solve the problems that PMs have, and specifically those PMs. Your product is the community and each individual's experience. You should understand dependencies and experience through a network of the people that are actually there. You should work with them directly, and that is your most important way to learn. If you are so inclined, definitely get Product Ops certified. And so don't forget that your job is to really just PM the PM experience. So thank you so much. I will just put up here is a QR code. If you're interested in finding out more about our Product Operations Certified course, you can go to this QR code. But yeah, with that, I mean, thank you so much, everybody, for listening to that. I would love to take questions and thoughts, and just in general, anything about like product operations that you've been thinking about or worried about. I'd love to hear about that and see if I can help.
Thanks very much, Chris. Really interesting conversation there. And we actually have had quite a few questions that have come throughout. So I know some of them you've touched on again a little bit, but we'll just run through them in order of what we've got. It's really, really interesting. So let's just go to the first one from Sinead said, on the what is product ops slide that you had, you put an emphasis on effectiveness and not on efficiency as much. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? Because she obviously sees them as two very important factors, rightfully so, and they both need to be prioritized. But without efficiency, you could have a culture of working towards something that's really perfect, regardless of the effort or the time. Without effectiveness, you're just moving fast for the sake of moving fast without it being sort of valuable outcomes. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the problem, is that efficiency, I think, goes after this idea that what really matters is that it's about throughput of the system in some way. And the reality is like, there will be times when you should stop and like reset or understand what is actually going on. And I don't think that those things always follow a schedule, right? I've been starting to talk to people about this kind of concept around Chronos and Kairos time. And it's not something I ever invented. It's like from very long time ago, as far as the idea of how do we have kind of regular check-ins, right? Like we work on some type of cadence. And so usually when it comes to product teams, that could be like quarterly planning or yearly planning or weekly releases or something like that. But these are like like regular time schedules that we need to adhere to. And a lot of the time, I think people mistaken that for we need to be as efficient as possible to make sure we get the most into this thing. When the reality is that it's more just about like time boxing what we're trying to do, because we want, in some ways, to not do humongous releases that take a very long time that don't allow us to learn as just like product managers, right? And so the other idea is this idea of like Kairos time, which is more about like big events that actually change the narrative of the team. And so to me, I think we need to have a balance between these two different things. And to me, effectiveness talks about that, which is that not only should we be like executing on a regular cadence, we want to have an urgency in what we're doing. We want to make sure that we're building something that our customers love and that they want to use and they want to pay us money for, or actually at least exchange value for. And so that's something we should be doing on a regular basis. We should be checking in on that. But we should also be aware that sometimes a major event in the system actually changes our ability to execute on what we were doing previously. And so I would argue, when I was at Facebook Reality Labs, we were working on the Portal device. And that was when the COVID suddenly kind of shut everything down. And so this idea of what we were thinking was important before that changes when most of the world is going to online, right? Meetings. And same thing with the idea of like, I'm in the core machine learning group within Google right now. When ChatGPT kind of captures the world's imagination at the end of last year, that kind of upends all of the plans we had around how valuable is generative AI, or at least what is the perceived value around that. So that's what I'd say is like, to me, the effectiveness is more about this balance between time and kind of narrative and finding the right way to do that as an organization. But I don't think it's just time. And to me, that efficiency is all about time. It's not about like narrative. And so that's what I would just say is your job is there to make sure that like product management is not only being on time with the things, ideally on time, but I think like basically performance to plan is like a horrible thing for you to do, right? The fact that you say you're going to ship something 6 months from now and you ship that exact thing, that says to me that you did not learn anything. So I think there's also that added need that if we are always adhering to our plans, we are probably doing so to kind of the lack of learning or the inability to learn. And so I think that is kind of the way that we should be thinking about this, is it's a combination between that like timing and that narrative. And I think it comes out within product operations as being focused on effectiveness rather than efficiency.
It's a really interesting point of view. Yeah, fantastic. We've had a range more questions as well here. Another one, is an acceptable proxy metric customer satisfaction scores where the people that are surveyed are PMs?
Yeah, I think this is, I think we get dangerously close to now turning our end customer into our customer. So that would be one thing I would say. But I think that this idea of kind of N order effects of what you do, right? So there was a Medium post, and I can't remember the author right now, but they made a really great point about this idea of like metrics, right? And so there are metrics where if you think about the idea of dropping like a rock inside of a pond or something like that, there are metrics that are right at the place where you dropped it, where you see a very large difference, right? And it's very near term. But then once you start getting out to the further and further points of the shore, you end up having a much smaller impact, and you may not even know if you see an impact when there's lots of rocks being dropped in a pond. And so what I would argue with is that the idea of like a product manager shipping something that increases click-through rate, for example, is like a very, very short-term, near-term type of effect. But it's not actually the effect that you care about, because you don't care about click-through rate. You actually care about the value or the outcome that the customer is trying to get to. And then finally, maybe you care about like being able to raise your next round of VC or share price or something like that, which is way far out on the edge of the pond. What I would say is like for product operations people using something similar around that model is that we can change a bunch of things, and we can like make it so that people are linking to each other's PRDs more, they're writing PRDs more effectively, maybe more quickly or whatever, right? But that customer thing is actually more like an N order effect for us. And so what I would be more interested in looking at is like, based on the amount of impact that we end up having or like engagement with a product team, I would love to see what is the difference in customer satisfaction scores between those different teams. Because I think what that leads to is like effectiveness of these teams could be related to customer satisfaction. Now, there are a bunch of people that are on my team as well that are like, PhD experts in surveys, and they will tell you customer satisfaction is a horrible metric to use in the first place. And so especially things like NPS and CSAT, there's just so many things that are going on. So I would just say like, I think what's more interesting is start to look at like, how does your work actually impact the ability for your teams to get these types of scores? And there's a lot of things that go into it. They're also going to have a very muddy kind of understanding of CSAT and NPS anyways. So I would just say that like you directly linking to that is not as helpful. It's more about the idea of like, how are you impacting the people? And then maybe if you can in some way make that linkage, you can then start to talk about like, how are you using product operations to help a product team get a better kind of result? But there's a lot of things you need to disentangle. And so I don't know, it's something that in general, I just don't trust CSAT in the first place, even when I'm a product manager. So I would say like even trying to do that for your org without trying to disentangle some of these like different effects, I think it's very hard. And I would not recommend it probably.
Fair enough. And I'm not sure if you've actually answered this in some way before, but
Yeah.
who should be looking at the efficiency metrics if it's not product ops?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really hard question. I mean, I think it's probably project management and maybe it's engineering management. The reason why is that project management and PMO and program management, all of that group is, in my opinion, is there to really make sure that we're not going to keep making the same mistake over and over again. And that's why they think a lot about this idea of like risk reduction, making sure everybody knows what's going on. Like their job is very much focused on that. And so from my perspective, what they would want to be looking at is like, is this team's efficiency suddenly wildly off, right? And what does that mean? And so this gets back to maybe that like whole point about velocity, right? Is like velocity is only meaningful inside of the team because the way that we end up working together, we end up understanding that when we start to do kind of like planning poker, or we assign complexity to a particular work item, it's based on what we believe internally, right? And it's based on what we actually understand as far as our rhythm. And so the only thing that you can really use velocity for is like, well, someone is out this week, so that means our velocity is naturally going to be down. So we should just assume we're not going to be able to do as much, right? Like that's what it should be used for. But what it ends up being used for is like to pit teams against each other as far as some like performance race around number of points, which again, like Goodhart's law is that you're just going to like turn this into a metric that is no longer meaningful. So that's why I think internally it's more of like an internal representation. And so that's why like to me, any efficiency metric ends up being like, are we going out of the bounds of what we usually expect? And so for me, project management, PMO, their job is to make sure we're not in a risky situation or that we're building process to avoid known risks that can really hurt us, right? And so that's why, like, for me, product operations is somewhere outside of the spectrum between risk and like managing uncertainty. We're there to kind of make sure that that conduit is there probably, and that tension is being built correctly. But anytime that you're going to overly focus on those types of efficiency metrics, you're going to basically create a system that rewards efficiency in the way that it is actually monitored rather than the idea of it actually being helpful. So that's what I'd say is like product ops, though. I mean, definitely one of the things that I think might be interesting to look at, and I've been trying to experiment with this a little bit more internally, is this idea of like, how do we start to look at the way the documents are actually being updated, are being created, linking to each other, getting engagement? To actually, as like, you know, I use this term smell a couple times in my presentation. If people are not familiar with that terminology, it comes from like code smells, where there's a whole book of like code smells where if you go into a piece of code and you see certain things, you're like, this is probably bad code based on the fact that like, it's like the idea of like smelling cheese. You're like, this is probably bad. The difference between good and bad cheese, like there's some smells that are bad and there's some smells that are good, right? So I would just say that like, the smell that something bad is happening is usually this idea of pattern recognition. And sometimes it can be done through the idea of a particular metric. So I'd say for me, efficiency metrics are when things are going off the rails, right? And so that's more interesting to me. So like what I would love to look at, and I'm trying to like figure out how to do this internally. We have things like activity dashboards for, say, Google Docs, right? It's something that's really interesting to look at. It will probably depress you a little bit to see how few people are actually reading your documents. But like, that is an important thing for us to see that like, hey, you know, we thought this document was going to be a canonical document that people would reference all the time, but it's not. And so that's a smell for the fact that like people are not actually internalizing this, referencing it, all this type of stuff. And so that's what I think of as efficiency metrics is, again, this like, are we out of bounds for what we usually think we are? And we should now investigate in some way. If you're not going to immediately investigate, or you're going to like try to help the team to figure out what's going on, then it's probably a bad metric in some way. In anyway, so yeah.
That's another really interesting one. So we had a question from Mark who says,
Yeah.
where or who do you feel should actually do the data analysis or build dashboards?
Well, I think no one should build a dashboard. I wrote a post that was called like dashboards are for are cowardly a little while ago. And so I think like in general, we think like whenever I see a dashboard as a feature on like a list of features, I'm just like, that's bullshit, right? Because it's not actually about the dashboard, right? It's about the fact that like we have a couple different needs when it comes to dashboards. One of them is emotional, right? Which is I feel like I have access to the rhythm of the business. I can understand what's going on. And it may not actually be true, right? Like, but it gives me an emotional kind of like comfort. It's a safety, it's an executive safety blanket, is what I used to call it, right? The real needs for dashboards, though, should be that when I see something change, that I now go take action somewhere. And that is maybe the hardest thing about the idea of like dashboards is that what is the decision making capability that you need, right? That is being conveyed in these dashboards. And so I think every time I see a metrics review that happens internally, my default question is like, what happens if this metric that you think is so important, what happens if it goes up a lot? What happens if it goes down a lot? And if the answer is like, I don't know, or nothing, like, then why are you tracking it? Right. And so that's the first thing I would say is that I think there's a lot of dashboards that are created just for this emotional safety blanket, when the reality is you need to build more trust, you need to have more check-ins, you need to do something different to actually provide that emotional kind of safety for everybody on the team. But secondarily, I think it should actually be people that know what the data is actually being used for, like what it was actually collected for, right? And it's people that are experts in the data in some way. And so there was a really great talk by like an NS1 CTO, and she was talking, sorry, head of data science, and she was talking about how like there's actually two types of needs that are made. One of them is this very high level pieces of information. When should this person go and say like, hey, you need to go and work on this thing, this is a problem right now, versus this very low level type of information, which is where the troubleshooters actually get the basics. And the problem is dashboards are usually this like mixture of both of those, so it helps neither. And so I think that is a real problem, right? Is that if you're going to build these things, the person who actually knows is probably the data engineer, right? The data engineer, the person who's like writing the code to collect the information, they actually know what is the real thing that is behind this data, which is this particular button click or this particular behavior or something like that. And then, from the other standpoint, it ends up being like a lot of the time we'll end up collecting lots and lots of data, right? In data lakes, data, I think lake house is the latest term, or bayou or swamp or whatever. But like some body of data is made available. And what ends up happening is that you strip all of the question or how it was collected away from the answer. And that is where I think like if we talk about things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, even data science, the biggest like kind of faults of bias, fairness issues, all those types of things come from the fact that we end up like really removing the understanding of how this thing was collected and why from the actual data itself. And that's why things like model cards and data cards are going to be so important longer term, I think, for the way that we deal with this stuff. But getting back to like your just question is like, who should be doing this? It's probably the data engineers. It's probably data scientists. It's people that have expertise in actually understanding data. Now, that doesn't mean that product managers shouldn't be working very closely with these people, right? Like at Facebook Reality Labs, we had a data scientist that was assigned to every product team to help us with this. And so the way I would work with them as a product manager was I had questions that are like this, like, I'd love to know, we want to understand in this particular case for a shared device, like how many people are actually interacting with the device at the same time. And so the things we then had to talk about was like, what stuff can we collect on the device? What actually is good from a privacy standpoint? What things should we be collecting? And what does this answer actually mean if we're using this type of sensor or whatever, right? And so I guess all I'm saying is like, those are the right type of people to be in that conversation rather than the idea of a product ops person, which is like there to set up the SQL queries into a Tableau database that it turns into a dashboard for executives. Those are probably not the right people to answer those questions, in my opinion. So those are the people that should be doing it. Data science teams, data engineers, the people that are actually like well versed in what is going on with the data itself.
Another question that we've had is, one of the problems that you identified was the lack of sharing or interaction amongst PMs. So how can product ops help when that's part of maybe the company culture, with a strong focus on empowered teams who function independently, really, with little interaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tough part about building interaction is you don't want to just be for interaction's sake, right? I mean, actually that's not true. you want some interaction for interaction's sake, because you want people to just like, the more time they spend together, the more they'll trust each other, the more they'll know each other, the more they'll understand each other. And so that's why, like, if you're in like a very remote type of organization, getting together like every 6 months and honestly just doing like random social activities. That's why we have like mixers and like other types of things. Just being around those people helps build better teams. So I would say there is some value to that. I think once we start to get into the realm of like, this was related to that talk of like how to make training look more like work, but it's, how do we use these opportunities to actually contextualize learning in some way? And so those could be that, like in, for example, a strategy conversation where we do a strategy conversation, say every quarter or every year even. I think it should be more frequent than that, but like say every quarter, you shouldn't just like talk about like, here's the strategy, you should go and learn it, and you should make sure you're within the bounds of it. Otherwise, you're not going to work on what you're working on. But we should actually use those moments to do things like, I think scenario planning is a really interesting activity where you look at the uncertainties of the future that you're worried about and then create different worlds and talk about what those worlds mean and like how would that impact our capability to exist. I think the idea of like, I just did a post with the uncertainty, basically the uncertainty project.org, which is, it's like a site just about kind of like decision making. And so posted something about it's basically called like decision or strategic rehearsal, where we kind of war game the way that the future may play out for our particular strategy. And so in those particular cases, I think there's like value in doing this where you do it as a group together, because then you actually learn from each other how they may provide that type of feedback. And so I think that's maybe the main thing I would just say in general is like, you need to create more opportunities for people to work with each other on the actual work they're doing. And that means through feedback cycles that could be more one-on-one, but it could also be group things. Maybe one last thing I would just add here is that, and this can also be like other types of things like case studies, decision forcing cases, games, that type of stuff. But I think like, you will never get people to ask for each other's advice or help unless you actually prioritize something within the organization. And so it's like the idea right now, we're trying to improve our writing culture within our org. And we want writing to be more concise. We want it to be clearer. We want it to be kind of, in some way, like leveling up is something that management will use as a terminology for this type of thing a lot of the time. And so we can't actually get that to happen though, unless one, our executive team and our managers start actually reading and commenting on all of the documents. We can't do that unless people have exposure to each other's documents. We can't do that unless people start actually seeing documents and the way that we end up writing our documents as really, really important. And so I think that's the thing to talk about, is not so much like, how do we get this person to do something, but how do we help them see that it's important? And there's all these different ways that you can start to make something important, but it's usually through, like, again, if you want a good writing culture, you need a good manager reading culture. And so that type of like simulation, or not just simulation, but emulation of the type of behavior you want, has to usually start at the top. And so that means one of the most important jobs that every manager can do is use their time, which is the most expensive thing they have, to actually focus on the things they care about the most. Right. And so if it's writing, they should spend a good chunk of their time just reading other people's documents and commenting on them. And so that's what I'd say is like, there's as a product ops person, you're not there to like get people to do things, right? That's the turning the screws on your product managers. What I want you to do is I want you to help identify what would be most helpful for the organization, like documents that are more concise, clear, and well read. Like that would be helpful, right? For us to share information across this. And management wants that, people want that, everybody wants that, right? So how do we now start to create the right types of cycles that will then do that? Like, it's almost like the idea of like flywheel thinking. What will get this kicked off and we'll keep it perpetuating? And so again, this is like a product management business model type of strategic discussion inside of a product would be like, what's our flywheel? You need to think about like in product operations, what's your flywheel for this particular type of problem, right? So that's maybe the way I would think about that.
Amazing. And I think we've just got time for one more question,
cool.
Unfortunately. So let's go on to the one that Janet put through. And she said, I've ended up doing a lot of PMO type work as this function doesn't exist on my side of the org. How can I move away from this and position myself to ease this tension between project management and product management if there's no one that's really doing that PMO role in the first place?
I mean, I think there's two things. So first, you should ask yourself a personal question, like, do you want to be product ops or do you want to be PMO? Because there's lots of people I work with that are great at PMO and they love doing PMO, right? Like when I was early in my career, I almost got like a project management certification essentially because at Microsoft, for example, program management is usually the combination of like project and product management. And while there were benefits to the same person owning the, back then we used a lot of Gantt charts and MS Project to plan out things. But like also this idea of like figuring out what the customers needed, but that tension wasn't there to be able to provide like the least risky, but also most innovative thing. And it ended up being like inside of one person. So I think like one, you should just make a decision, I think, about like what it is you're most passionate about, because then that leads to the second thing, which is you should start to show and make a case for having these things as separate. And you should then decide which side you want to be on when that actually happens. So that's all I'd say is like, if there's not a PMO there are huge advantages to having a project management or PMO organization that is helping organize and de-risk a lot of the way that this type of execution happens. But that is very different than the idea of like, how is this community of practice or product manager kind of experience working out? What this could also say, though, is that maybe it's too early for product operations inside your particular organization. Right? Like product ops is usually not hired first, and they're usually not hired in the middle either. And so a lot of the time, the product operations role, it should be actually, I mean, I think the ideal that a lot of people put it at, if you look at, say, competencies of managers, of product managers, it's usually the product manager that should have the competencies for doing things like community of practice, individual experience, learning and improvement, all that type of stuff. And the problem there is that they never have time for it, right? They're doing their own job, plus they're having to manage people. And when I say manage, I mean like not just the mechanisms of management, but leadership and mentoring and all this other stuff. And so they very rarely now think about like the way their team works, right? And so that is the issue, is that we need to in some way like figure out how we, I guess, allow for that time, allow for that role that is truly incentivized around that. And so I don't know, I think like it could just be that it's too early as well for your team. And I think, that's I think something that as product people in general, like product ops or product management, there should be times where we also like we were talking about like stopping or reducing process in some ways. There are lots of product managers I work with where they're like, our product or this feature should be shut down. And so sometimes you just need to actually make that case, right? And so I guess like I would just say it sounds like it could be too early, but it also may be that you just need to have a split role because there's advantages to having this type of tension. And I think if you think about teams as kind of cross-functional people that all have different viewpoints that provide a lot of really great tension to build a great product, right? Like in the talk I did at the last Product Ops Summit in New York, right, about deciding how to decide, the reason why we have group decision-making is because we want people to bring diverse opinions and we like make better decisions together. So I think the main argument here is that a PMO that is focused on risk reduction and a product ops person that is focused on effectiveness of the PM, that is a good separation of tension in some way. So that's what I'd say is first, think about which side you want to be on, which is fine. Again, I'm not going to take it personally for a product ops summit and we're talking about like project management. But then two, you should try to make a best case effort for like which one of those tensions is best and how do we actually like create that within the team.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, some really, really interesting insights here. And we've actually had quite a lot of comments in the chat saying interesting insights. Thank you for the feedback. Thank you for your talk. Somebody also said before that they really enjoyed the course. I think Gabby said that the course is incredible. So it is all delivered by Chris. So if you do want to go and find out more about it, please do just send him a message on LinkedIn possibly, or in our Slack community group. I've included the links in the chat throughout. So if you have got any more questions, please reach out to him directly. But also, there is a wealth of knowledge and loads of things that you can basically keep. It is an access for life course. So once you've got that, you can keep referring back to it and having a look. I think it is a really, really valuable tool for people to use and to go back and to check. But thank you so much, Chris, for taking the time to speak to us all today about this. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you involved in this Product Operations Festival. And I hope that all of our attendees who have stayed with us right till the end of this session will be back again for the following 3 sessions that we've got for the rest of the day.
Great. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Chris. See you again soon. Bye.